guys, welcome back to the Anime Collector. Today for my collection we're going to be talking about Zipang, and I'm a little bit underprepared for this review. It's been a long week. I lost my wallet and I've had to do all sorts of things, canceling cards and scheduling appointments with the DMV. And I haven't had time, obviously, to rewatch all 7 volumes of this anime. But I did see it for the first time in December, so it is pretty fresh in my mind, and I feel like I need to kind of talk about it now so that it doesn't get more and more diluted over time. Now, the very first memory I have of Zipang, like my personal history with it, is that, and I want to sort of bring you guys into my perspective watching the show, and it all sort of starts with how I found out about it. So the way I found out about Zipang is that I saw the trailer for it on another Genion title, and I basically learned what the show is about. So here's basically what Zipang's premise is. A modern-day Japanese battlecruiser of the SDF, the Self-Defense Force, and its crew they're basically out at sea when a storm hits. They're sent back in time, and they end up right at the Battle of Midway, which is a very crucial point in World War II between the Americans and the Japanese, and very crucial for Japan in that they get kind of massacred a bit at this battle, and they have to decide once they realize they're in the middle of World War II. Do they let history play out as it's supposed to, let Japan lose the war, or do they actually aid their ancestors in this battle in order to try to change the tides of war in favor of Japan so that Japan might actually win World War II and completely alter the future? And when I heard that, I was like, that is the most incredible, inventive concept I have ever heard, ever. How amazing of an idea is that, just to be able to behold this show? And, you know, this was released by Genion, so at the time it's like, this was really hard to get. Genion titles are incredibly expensive. They always have been. And then, of course, Genion eventually went out of business and everything's out of print, and it's just, it took me a long time to get my hands on it. In fact, I think that this is the most, I think this is the longest it's ever taken me to get a show that I've really wanted to see that was actually available. Like, when I mentioned with Mad Bull, I learned about it, and then maybe 2 or 3 or maybe even up to 4 years later, probably only 2 or 3 years later though, I eventually got my hands on it because it got licensed. With this show, there is no measurement comparison to how much hype I had for this show, because I've been trying to get my hands on it for the past 6 years. And it took me a really, really long time to get it. And when I finally did, I was just so psyched to watch it in December of this last year. And I had some friends over and I'm like, dude, we gotta sit down and marathon this thing. It's gonna be awesome. And I was telling them about how awesome the concept was. And as soon as I start putting the disc in, one of my friends was like, you know, this sounds a lot like the premise to an American movie that came out in the 80s called The Final Countdown, where like an aircraft carrier or something is sent back in time, and they have to decide whether or not to aid in the war effort. And I'm like, well, that really puts a damper on the hype I've been building up for the last 6 years trying to get this show. But let's be honest here in that this has to be way more interesting from the perspective of the Japanese who lost the war, because there's actually a lot more at stake. Because the way I kind of see it is, and I'm sure that The Final Countdown, which I have not seen, but I'm sure that that film probably approaches it from a very interesting angle that's just a different angle than the way that Zipang approaches the concept. But the way I kind of see it is, going back in time, the crew basically has to decide, do we do nothing and let America win the war, or do we intervene and win the war even sooner? You know, so it's like, from Japan's point of view, it's like, that's actually a very big difference, where it's like, do we intervene and potentially win the war and alter the course of history? Is that moral? Is that something that we could even conceive being able to do? You know, does one modern day battlecruiser stand up against the entire fleet of World War II? You know, it's like all these things that make that a much more interesting concept, you know? And the show is like absolutely outstanding. And there's a lot of things about the show that really kind of hit you in the face right off the bat, you know? Things that really you kind of don't necessarily expect. Like a couple of preconceived notions I had going into it were things like I would have thought that, first of all, I don't know what I would have done in their shoes, you know, going back in time and having to decide, do you help or not? Because the men, basically, the ship is called the Mirai, and the crew of the Mirai, right off the bat, they all sort of decide, we should not alter history, because if we do, it's going to change the Japan that we want to get back home to. We have loved ones there, we have a life there, and we want to be able to get back to the Japan that we know, the Japan that we love. And if we alter history in any way, that Japan might not exist anymore. And also, who knows if we're even going to get back, you know? Who knows if the Mirai is actually going to be able to return to the future? Who knows? And those are sort of the things that you look at. And I was thinking, like, it would probably be better to not alter history at all. But as the show does very, very well, they prove that by merely existing in that time frame, you can't help but send ripples through time and alter things and set the course of history in a different direction. Very slowly but surely altering every important figure of that time period's path is basically being altered due to the existence of this ship in this time period. And it's just really amazing. And I want to talk real quick about, sort of like I said, I want to take you guys through my mindset in watching this. The things that I felt, the things that I thought about, and the place that my mind went while I was watching this show. So these are the puzzle pieces I was working with in watching this show. Now I want to go ahead and talk about what each DVD is titled. So the first DVD, and again, I had already seen the trailer, so I knew what the premise was. And they literally go back in time by the end of the very first episode, so they don't waste any time. You know, they have a little bit of character development in the beginning, and then they go back in time right away. So it's like the trailer's not really ruining anything because you'd learn this in the very first episode. But the first disc is called Future Shock. All right, so I know they go back in time. That's not too crazy. And then the second volume is called The Ghosts of History. And then the third volume is called A Time for War, which, of course, I wonder, like, is it called that because they get roped into the war? I sort of expect that they wouldn't be running away the whole time. That wouldn't make the show very interesting, right? Then the next one is called Attack on G Island. And I have to think, are they attacking whatever G Island is supposed to mean? Then the next one is Friend or Foe. And actually something kind of interesting, like, you guys remember in the Mad Bull review how I talked about how at that one sequence where Perrine like pushes Jackie out of the way in order to check on Daizaburo and see if he's okay. If you watch it frame by frame, Perrine disappears and then comes back. And actually something else I noticed while I was working on that video is that Jackie gets put in the wrong layer. So she's supposed to be behind Daizaburo, like her leg is in forced perspective and stuff. And all of a sudden it's on top of his head, so she looks like she has this really super tiny miniature foot. You know, I was talking about mistake in the animation. Well, this isn't really a mistake in the animation, though there is something I gotta get off my chest about the show that really bothered me for reasons that probably you wouldn't even understand. But something that I noticed with the DVDs, at least the ones I have, maybe eventually they fix them in a later print, I don't know. But on the DVD covers to each one, like for instance, this is Friend or Foe. It says Friend or Foe on the DVD menu. And if I remember correctly, it was Attack on G Island. It doesn't say Attack on G Island on the DVD menu for this. It actually says Friend or Foe. So in this particular situation, it actually has the wrong title. Like they just made a little bit of a mistake. And then now the sixth DVD, which I talked about a little bit in my last tip from the Anime Collector segment, where I talked about the second to last volume basically always being the rarest and most expensive. Now the sixth DVD has something really interesting with it. Let me talk about the seventh real quick. The seventh is called Return to the Future. And obviously that's going to sort of give away something big, right? I mean, Return to the Future, I guess I don't need to worry if they're going to get back home, right? They're definitely going to get there by the final volume. And then you guys will notice that all of the DVDs so far have had the title Zipang written on the cover, and they're also like written on the spine and whatnot. But with Volume 6, Target Mirai, for some reason it's not there. And I thought maybe that was symbolic of something that happens in the episodes on that disc. But I really have no idea why it ended up being that way. So that was kind of interesting. Now, before I forget, and just to sort of get it out there so I don't end with this and sort of put a damper on this review, I want to talk about a couple things that kind of bothered me animation-wise with it. Now, because this show is about a battle cruiser, a great deal of the show takes place on the water. And they use like a cel-shaded 3D model of this boat. And it's one of those things where it might take a tiny bit of getting used to, but it doesn't look bad. It's definitely got some top-notch 3D in it. If it had been made a little bit later than the show actually was made, I would have expected to see some really nice shading on it. Just a little bit better form to it that I think could have really looked good. Like the way that they draw in shows like, and I'm probably going to pick something that doesn't actually do this and I'm remembering it wrong, but I think in like Black Lagoon, sort of the way that they shade the weaponry really looks quite nice. And I feel like they could do that with the whole ship in 3D pretty easily, and it would have looked really, really nice, but it doesn't look bad. For the age and how old this show is, it actually looks pretty decent, so I'm not harping on it there, but because it takes place on the ship, there's a lot of water around them all the time, and like when they're moving through the water is like, you know, trailing behind the boat, and there's like the wakes and stuff, and with basically almost every single time you'll see water in the show, they're pioneering this new sort of technique on how to handle water, and it's a little bit awkward to look at. And like in the opening title for the show, and I really don't have a good way of showing you guys this because at the moment with this channel I don't feel comfortable showing actual clips. And you know, I try to keep things small in the screenshots and stuff so that I'm not going to get flagged for content ID, because technically I'm not hurting the show, I'm actually promoting the stuff on here. But YouTube sort of automates all this stuff, so it gets to the point where I'm sort of at YouTube's mercy. So I try not to tempt the beast. But there's really not any way for me to show you guys this in just screenshots, but the effect that they use is just really weird. And sometimes you watch it and it's like, it's so ugly and yet also so beautiful. And other times it's like, that looks terrible, but actually towards the end of the show, they seem to get their technique really down and it actually looks really nice. Like this weird effect that they use. But something I want to talk about that really bothered me, which ended up in every single episode, because oftentimes I'll watch the ending and opening themes to every episode, because I feel like that's a somewhat important way for me to perceive the show, because I might notice something about the openings that's either they change, or either the openings change, or the stuff that they show in the opening might spark something. Like I feel like I'm supposed to watch it because the original creators want you to start noticing things that maybe you didn't notice before. And one thing that happens at the end credits that's really annoying to me is that the credits are scrolling up, right? So here's your window of view, and the credits are going above that. They're moving forward, upward, so that the text scrolls upward, and that's how you kind of see the names of the credits and stuff. Well, if you were to film, like let's say you were to write all the text onto a piece of paper and film it, you would have the paper and stuff here, and the way you would do this is you'd start up here so that the names are down here, and you'd scroll basically down, right? So the paper, if we were to look at it that way, is moving up, right? Now something that they show at the end of the credits is one of the last things that they do is they're looking at a picture of a tree, and they're going down this painting, this drawing, this background of this tree, and they stop at the bottom of the tree where within the roots is growing like an orchid or some sort of flower. And what's really irritating to me is that, like I said, the camera, if you were to look at the credits, is going down. It's moving down the frame, and the tree is also moving down the frame, and they're moving down at different rates. So at one point towards the end, where right before the tree gets to the flower, the speed at which the camera's panning down on the tree and the speed at which the credits are scrolling up converges, and it feels like all of a sudden the credits stop moving completely and then start again. And it's something that, like, it's just something to do with my training, my visual artistic training, that I noticed that, and it's really jarring for me. Like, it's a really kind of stupid mistake that I felt like they really should have been able to come up with something different, because that's really jarring. It's a really kind of bad way to handle things, and I just feel like it could have been done in a lot more visually pleasing way. And it was a constant reminder at the end of every episode, because it's the end credits, you know. So that was pretty annoying. But the show is really good. The original creator, like, I looked at the premise, like I look at the concept of the show, and I try to think of it from my point of view, like what would I have had them do, you know? And I would go into like straight in action mode, and it would have just been like firing missiles and taking out, you know, stuff, and it would have been actually quite boring to look at it from the way I probably would have handled things, because I don't actually have a very firm grasp. I'm not a history buff, and I don't have a very, very firm grasp of World War II. And something that they did in the show, which is actually, it's helpful, and you could kind of look at it as a cop-out, is that one of the characters on the ship is a huge war history buff, and he knows basically everything there is to know about the Japanese Imperial fleet and everything that they used, all the Americans' fleet. He basically knows the specs of everything from that time period, and they use, like, visually, like, or sorry, from production standpoint, let's say it that way, they use this character in order to bring the audience up to speed, give them knowledge. They use him to educate us watching the anime. And you'd think that, like, yeah, they're just doing that so that I don't, so that I actually understand the significance of this or that, or to help me understand just how much more advanced the ship is. But what's actually pretty cool about the show is that they don't just use him for that. The crew actually utilizes him as a major asset, being in the past. He's the guy who basically realizes that they're at the Battle of Midway. He recognizes, I think it's the battleship Yamato and Nagato or whatever, and he recognized the formation, and he knows right away that this is what he knows is their formation on their way to the Battle of Midway. And it's weird enough to see these ships that shouldn't really be out in the ocean at any time. Like, there's no reason for them to be there. And I was saying before that, like, they utilize this guy in order to help you understand just how much more advanced the Mirai is than the ships and things of that time period. And something that you can't help but sort of think, if you, I mean, maybe if you know a bit more about World War II and stuff, you might have had a different grasp of this. But, like, I know technology has advanced a lot since World War II, like an awful lot. But I do think about it, like, honestly, how much more advanced could they possibly be? And they make it very, very, very clear right off the bat, in that as soon as the Mirai ends up at the Battle of Midway, they're basically on a collision course with the Yamato. And they have to, like, maneuver out of the way. And it's like, just by existing in this time period, like literally from the moment they end up in this time period, they alter the course of history by maneuvering away and actually not colliding with the Yamato, because the crew of the Yamato sees the Japanese flag, and they see this maneuver, then they're like, oh my goodness, how did that ship actually make that? How is there a maneuverable ship like this? This technology does not exist. This is mind-blowing. How do we not know that our own Japanese Navy has this capability, you know? So right off the bat, Japan is aware that this ship exists, and they, like, radio back to headquarters and give them a description of the ship. And then, of course, Japan starts sending you know, planes and ships and stuff to kind of investigate. You know, they're looking for the ship to know what's going on. You know, they want to gather some intelligence. And then shortly after that, like not very far into the series, they get discovered by, like, an American submarine. And they actually, I think at this point, they cut the engines because they're having a very serious discussion on the deck of the ship. And the Americans actually fire a torpedo at them. Because they're like, you know, they're a sitting duck. They haven't started their engines. Like, we'll just sink them and move on. And they fire the torpedo, and somebody in the control deck or whatever of the Mirai is like, they fired upon us. They get the engines running, and they maneuver, and they actually dodge the torpedo. Like, and the Americans are just dumbfounded. Like, how on earth did they do that? That is impressive, you know? And something that I thought they sort of ran a potential risk of doing in this anime is I sort of expected that it would be a bit of a propaganda sort of show. I figured that that they would kind of treat America with just sort of a spiteful view. And I kind of expected, at the very least, for it to be very similar to the baseball episode of Samurai Champloo, where the Americans talk like just ridiculously stereotyped and stuff. But actually, surprisingly, they really have a very high respect for the American soldiers and stuff. And I was actually taken back by just how respectful the portrayal of them was. And they don't treat them like monsters. They don't treat them like savages or anything. They actually treat them with a lot of respect. And in turn, they also show that they have a lot of respect for the Japanese. Probably even more respect than American soldiers really probably did have for the Japanese. It's just... I don't know, the amount of respect it's the perfect amount where you actually appreciate it as an audience, where it doesn't feel slandered one way or the other or whatever. It doesn't seem like they're being too harsh or something. Something else about the show, like I was saying before, that it's like I would probably alter history maybe, but as I'm watching the show, I'm like, you know what, they do make a good point that if they do change history, the Japan that they know is going to be different. And what's really interesting with this is that something I never would have considered, because I guess, like I said, I don't have a firm grasp of World War II's history, but they help you to understand something that I never would have ever grasped if I hadn't watched the show. And that is that from the point of view of the modern day Japanese in this series, they actually portray it and help the audience to understand that Japan is actually better off having lost the war. Japan's economy is booming. They're a respected nation. They're allied with really strong people, and they just garner a lot of respect in this day and age because they lost the war. Like, the course of history ended up being all for the betterment of Japan in the long run because they lost the war. And if they had won the war, they might actually have crumbled and collapsed. And it's really an interesting take on the idea, because when you look at it, it doesn't feel that way. It doesn't feel like, on the surface, it feels like, yeah, if they had won the war, maybe they'd be ruling the world. But actually, the way that they kind of portray it is like it could actually have wiped Japan out of existence in some ways by winning the war. And they really put it into perspective in a very interesting way. So the crew is very much against altering history. But like I said, just by being there, they can't help but have already started to alter history. And what's really interesting is that the person that you sort of identify with most in the show is the executive officer of the Mirai. His name is Yosuke Karamatsu, and they call him the XO. They just call him XO, which obviously stands for executive officer, and that's probably what I'm going to be calling him for this review, just so it's not very confusing. You are supposed to be kind of in his shoes, and I just want to say, I think this is my favorite character for an anime that I've ever had in a very, very long time. Like, and a big portion of what makes me really like this guy is the guy who voices him in the English dub. Now, I know I've been really pushing for English dubs and saying like the English dub is great. I recommend the English dub. Now, obviously, I'm watching English dubs right now because I can get through a show quicker when I'm rewatching it, and I can comprehend it, and I don't make mistakes from reading something wrong that confuse me, and I have to rewatch stuff or whatever, or it's going too fast, and I have to keep pausing to actually get through what they're saying, because it just, some shows are really complicated. They say a lot of things. And this is one of those shows because it's very historical and stuff, and hearing it made it easier. But when I rewatch shows, it's like I do watch them in English. So if I'm ever going to recommend something as you should enjoy the sub over the dub, either it's only going to have a sub, there's not going to exist a dub, or I'd already seen it prior in its subtitled, you know, the original Japanese language, and after rewatching it dubbed, I would still prefer the Japanese one. But in this particular case, I do want to say the dub is excellent, you know, and I mentioned in Mad Bull that most dubs are, they're at a middle ground. You know, they're not that much better than any other show, they're not that much worse than any other show, but that middle ground is still a range where I enjoy shows in that range. I can fully enjoy a show at the middle ground because the middle ground is usually more or less just at that same level of the middle ground Japanese dubs, like the normal anime stuff. So they're pretty decent. Now I would say that every character falls into that middle ground, and a couple of them raise the bar just a little bit. But Katamatsu, the XO, man, this guy's voice acting is top notch, just absolutely top notch. It was so outstanding. He has this warmth, this soul to his voice. He's got this a slightly raspy, very strong voice to him, and I was like, holy crap, I don't think I've ever heard this guy's voice before. And for me, that's really weird because I've seen a lot of shows. So when I hear somebody that I don't recognize, that's a big deal. And I stupidly went straight to Anime News Network to find out who he was. It turns out that he was voiced by Mark R. Kaufman. And I'm looking through his stuff, I'm like, how is this guy only voiced for animes? I was telling you about the puzzle pieces that, like, this is how my brain went when watching a show. This is the path it took and the conclusions I came to. And I gave you the puzzle pieces that are kind of laid out with the names of it, especially Return to the Future. It's like, okay, well, now I know that they get back to the future, so that kind of sucks. Well, furthermore, my experience with this was that I looked up Mark R. Kaufman, and I find out that he voices the XO, but only up until episode 23. Which is the 6th volume. That's where it ends. So 24, 25, and 26 on Return to the Future, he's voiced by somebody else. So when I look at that, I'm like, this is the conclusion I sort of came to towards the beginning of the show. I'm thinking to myself, here's what's going to happen in the final volume. The Mirai is going to be sent back to the future, and the executive officer is not going to be on board when it happens. He's going to be on shore somewhere, and then the final volume is going to take place in modern-day Japan, and the executive officer is going to be an old man, and that's why he's got a different voice. I mean, that's got to be it, right? That's got to be it. And I want to tell you guys right now that while I was watching this show, I was so pumped to get in here and start recording a review. Literally, after every single disc, I'm like, man, I don't even want to finish this show. I just want to gush about how awesome it is. It's so freaking insane how they view things and how they don't leave anything. Like any potential thing that you would never have thought of, they thought of it. And they make sure that the drama and the course of history is affected in a very realistic way, in a way that you would never expect, but is incredibly plausible and very, like, just the realism to it is amazing. And I wanted to come in here after every single episode. And then I got to the final volume. And the biggest letdown that I have suffered in any anime in a very, very long time happens. They do not get back to the future. I don't know why it's called Return to the Future. I don't know. They blow up the Mirai, this, like, I haven't been this disappointed in the ending to an anime since I finished Baki the Grappler, which is a show that's so crappy that you can't help but want to see it. And I'm sitting through this very terrible show, in the case of Baki the Grappler, and I'm watching this tournament, and I'm like, okay, there's only 4 episodes left, so he's about to fight his dad. He's finally going to beat his dad, who he's fought a couple times in the show and lost horribly, and he's been training like hell, and he's finally going to fight his dad, and he's finally going to win, and then I get to say that the show's over and I saw it, And then I'm like, okay, 3 episodes left, awesome, 2 episodes left, awesome, okay, here it is, the final episode. Baki is going to fight his dad, he's going to beat the crap out of him, and he's going to win, and then he's going to win the championship or whatever, and that's how the show's going to end, and it's going to finally be a satisfying end to this long, crappy anime journey I've taken. And the final episode comes, and it's a flashback of Baki's dad fighting in, like, the Vietnam War against guys who have guns, and he fights by himself, barehanded, and takes on the army. And it's just like, yeah, that was pretty interesting, pretty cool to say the least. But Baki never fights his dad. And I was so ticked. I was so ticked that I didn't get to see that. Zipang takes the cake over that big time. because it gets to the exact point where it's the point of no return. They blow up the Mirai. They are not going to get back. They decide that the best thing to do for the course of history is to destroy their ship. And it's like, they destroy the ship and they all embrace the fact that we didn't ask for this, but our choices while we're here and just in being here have caused things to get very messy. And our path is clear. We have to stop. I didn't talk about this character at all. We have to stop Kusaka. I'll have to get back to him. We have to stop Kusaka, and it's like everybody is, their mind is made up. They know what they have to do. They have to move forward and attack their destiny, basically. They have to move into that mindset. Then the show just ends. It just completely ends, and it's like, oh, you should read the manga. There is no English release for the manga. And I have seen shows where I'm like, man, that manga is probably pretty good. I'd like to read it, but it's too much hassle to collect it and stuff, and I'll probably never do it. I would easily get every manga of this series and read it cover to cover because of how amazing this was. And I'll say this right now, okay? And you can hold me to this. If this YouTube channel ever gets ridiculously huge, and I'm actually bringing in a lot of money, enough money to support my family so I can do this full time, enough money on top of that, that I actually could start utilizing that money, I will pay out of my own pocket to get the Zipang manga brought over to America. That is how strongly I feel about how much this should be here. It's such a letdown. In fact, if I had an absurd amount of money, I would actually get them to animate a second series to it, because that is how enthralled I became with the series. I was so into this series. It's just such an amazing concept, such an amazing idea, and they handle it so beautifully. And I completely skipped talking about Kusaka. So let me take a step back now that I've sort of ruined the flow of this review and sort of explain the choices that were made by the XO and how they kind of affect the course of history. Now the executive officer, Katamatsu, this guy is a total badass. And I'll admit most of it is his his English dub voice. And it's just something about him is just so epic every time he's on screen. He's definitely the most prepared of the crew to enter into actual battle conditions. And something you guys should understand is that that this crew, they're like new recruits. This is the SDF, not the Imperial Navy of World War II. These guys are part of the Self-Defense Force. They're not prepared for actual full-time warfare. You know, they're not ready for that. But this guy steps up to the plate and says, you got to do what you got to do. It can't be helped, you know? And you find yourself, he basically is given, they trust him to make the decisions. Everybody else says, like, we don't want to alter history. We want to be able to get back to Japan. And we've clearly already started, you know, like I said, putting ripples through the waves, so to speak, the waves of time. And we trust you to make the decisions, because this is too much for the entire crew. We're just going to fight about it if we don't put our trust in one leader. And you know, he's the executive officer of the ship, so it makes sense that they would put their trust in him. And I'll admit, following this guy and putting myself in his shoes, which is how the story's portrayed, where that's what the audience is meant to do. I found myself making 90% of the same choices as him. I really did feel like he was doing what was right. And one of the very first things that happens right after the Battle of Midway, man, I really butchered this review. I wish I had more time to have prepared for this, but like I said, I've had a really hellish week. Right after the Battle of Midway, they find a downed airplane. And they see somebody hanging out like the side, and the airplane is sinking slowly into the ocean, and then it just starts like plunging in. Like he's going to basically die. Like they know that if they don't do something, he's going to die. And it's like, this is like right when they realize they're in the past, and they're like, okay, we don't want to change the future. We unfortunately don't get to make. We don't get to sleep on this concept. We don't get to have a great meeting and say, should we save this guy? I mean, we are kind of fiddling with history here. No, they don't have that time to make that decision. The XO jumps directly into the water and he saves him. And I'm like, you know what? To be fair, I would have done the same thing, especially as he's a member of the SDF. It's like, that's his duty. That's what he's trained to do. He can't let somebody just die. He can't watch them die. That would go against everything he stands for. And they save a guy. His name is Takumi Kusaka. And he's pretty much the worst person they possibly could have saved. I don't want to equate this to in Monster, when the doctor in Monster saves that kid and he grows up to be a serial killer, and it's like the worst decision he's ever made was helping that kid, doing the surgery on that kid instead of that mayor or whatever. But it is kind of like that in the guy that they end up saving is an intelligence officer. This person was supposed to die in the war, but he didn't. And he's an intelligence officer, so as soon as he comes to on the Mirai, he starts studying the Mirai, and he basically is able to learn everything about it through walking through the ship and figuring things out. And it gets to the point where they're like, okay, we can't know what he's thinking, the mindset that this guy has, but obviously our best bet is probably to tell him the truth. So they explain to him, we're from the future, Japan loses this war, and they give him the ability to read in their library under the hopes that he will embrace Japan losing the war in the end and understand, which granted, for somebody who's from beyond the war, somebody who basically lives in a life that takes place after World War II, that's a lot easier to accept because you don't know the Japan of pre-World War II, and for the guy in the Imperial Navy, he does not necessarily accept it with the same sort of mindset, so to speak. And like I said, they give him this opportunity to learn about it, and this guy plays them like fools. He is an incredible strategist, and he manipulates the crew into altering history for his sake. And the title that I want to get to about why is it called Zipang is that apparently, and I learned this from watching the show, Zipang, like before Japan was known as Japan, and of course Japan, in Japanese, they don't call Japan Japan, they call it Nihon or Nippon. But before Japan was given the name of Japan, it was known as Zipang by Westerners. And so Kusaka said, like, basically at some point it's revealed where he basically says that, now I'm not fighting in this war the same way anymore. I'm not fighting to keep your Japan alive. I'm not fighting to let the war play out and everybody who needs to die is going to die and whatever, and the bomb's going to get dropped in Japan and then we lose the war. I'm not fighting for that future, and I'm also not fighting for the future of we should win this war. I'm fighting for a new future. I'm not fighting for Japan anymore. I'm fighting for Zipang. I'm fighting for a new nation that basically he's going to rule. And he goes, he's like a megalomaniac, kind of like he uses this knowledge that they bestowed on him to basically turn into a supervillain. And he manipulates everybody in the show for his own ends. And it's amazing. It's really amazing watching them write this sort of character into the show. Really crazy, deep, dramatic stuff in there, and it's really awesome. And I think, and I'm having I'm having a harder time remembering stuff that happens towards the end of the show than towards the beginning. But I want to talk to you guys about the idea that, like, because time travel is something I could talk about for months without stopping. I could just keep going and just explore all the avenues, and it would be really hard for you guys to understand because I would just keep jumping back and forth on different time travel sort of theories and stuff. But basically, they kind of realize at one point that they're not from the same Japan as the future that they're creating. And I think if I remember correctly, what happens is Karamatsu, like in the very first episode, you see young EXO Karamatsu with his dad. And I guess his dad, I think, was probably involved in the war effort. at one time, and he like idolizes his dad, and he joins the SDF because of his father and stuff. At one point, Katamatsu ends up in a place where he knows that his dad is still a young kid at this time, and it's kind of playing off. You think it's going to happen is it's going to play off what happens at the beginning, because at the beginning you see a guy who looks exactly like Katamatsu, the executive officer. You see a guy who looks exactly like him, who's voiced by Mark R. Kaufman, is going to be the same guy, and then he's got his kid with him, and that's supposed to be, from my understanding, that's Katamatsu's dad, and the little kid is Katamatsu, Yosuke Katamatsu. And then I kind of looked at it as like, okay, they're going to mirror it, where now Katamatsu's going to be the adult, and his dad is going to be the age that he was in the opening. I'm like, that's kind of an interesting concept. And he goes to this place to talk to his father. He just needs to speak to his father because he's missed him. I believe he died in the time frame of where he came from. So he wants to talk to his father. He's compelled to meet with him and at least see him. And he goes to see him and he finds out that his father has died. So it's like they realize that they can't be from the same Japan of this timeline, because if they were, that he would not have existed, so to speak. Like that's kind of, and there's a lot of different sort of time travel ideas, but basically from Katamatsu's point of view, even if they could get back to the future, his future is completely changed. Like he actually kind of doesn't have a place. He probably wouldn't even exist in that future. So it's kind of like at that point. And by the way, what happens? If I remember correctly, his dad gets killed by some Imperial Navy officers who are driving a car, and they hit him. Like they kill him. And these guys are only there because of the Mirai existing in this time frame. So them simply existing there causes his dad to be killed. And at that point, Katamatsu basically doesn't have anything to lose, because he doesn't have the same Japan future that he would have ever had. And everybody at that point, this is towards the end of the story, everybody at that point is there where it's like, there's nothing left. Like, our future is already so screwed up now that even if we got back there, there's just no way that we would have the same life. So now we have to make the best of it, and we've got to basically make the people who are responsible for all this stuff pay. And like I said, they got to go after Kusaka and really, like, they got to stop him. They got to stop this megalomaniac, evil genius doctor guy. That sort of mindset. He's like a Bond villain plus 10, a crazy level of manipulation, and he's basically a psychopath. And it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy to watch. And that's basically that point where, like I said, like his dad dies, and it's like, what are we fighting for? We're not fighting for the same Japan we were. We're not going to get back there, And then they make these decisions, these life-altering decisions, where basically they say, all right, well, we were holding back. We were trying to prevent change. Now it's time to enact change. And the change we're going to enact is altering the future that Kusaka is trying to get. And that's where the show gets really good. And like I said, it just ends. It just ends. Oh my God, why? Why do you have to end on me like that? It drives me nuts, It drives me nuts to see stuff like that happen. And it seems like that happens. Like, how did I not see it coming, really? Because as you're like, oh, there's only 3 episodes left, I really don't know how they're going to wrap this up. Yeah, of course they're not. And it seems like this happens far too often in anime. But ironically, it's like there's a time where it seems like every single Japanese movie or Japanese show or anime that I ever watched seemed to end this way, where it just kind of just like that's it, and they leave it up to the viewer, the audience to decide, kind of thing. But in the case of Zipang, what probably really happened was that this is season 1, and if sales, like if it had done well, they would have potentially gone into a season 2. And I'm really quite sad that it didn't do well in Japan enough to obtain that next season, or perhaps it was similar to my understanding of how Berserk ended, where they caught up to the manga. And in Berserk you can sort of tell, because Puck's not there, that they were sort of planning to do only 1 season. In spite of all that, in spite of being so severely let down, and I haven't been let down that bad since Baki the Grappler, but that was a different story, because with Baki it's like, that show's so crappy and yet you just can't look away, and it's almost painful to get through it. This show was an actual delight. Every minute of it was really interesting, and then all of a sudden it just pulls the rug out from under you. But in spite of all that, like in everything I've said, like this is a great series. And if you don't have a similar rule set that I do, where I exclusively watch shows that I own, and I exclusively read manga that I own, and you have a way to obtain the manga, I would recommend reading it, because it's got to be awesome. Now, in addition to everything I mentioned about how devious Kusaka is, and just how interesting the story is woven together, one thing that actually blew my mind really is that, like when I was, my preconceived notion with this was that they probably wouldn't have made, like in the question of should they aid the war effort or should they let history play out as it may, and watch Japan lose the war. It's like that's probably the safer route, to let Japan lose, but from the very beginning it turns out that they've already altered too much, and they can't, like, just from existing there, they can't take that route, even if they want to, because there's nowhere to hide, and just wait out the war, because they're being pursued from right off the bat from both America and Japan, basically. And then from there, it's like, I guess they would have to aid in the war effort in some way, and they actually try to choose, like, what they do is, and this is part of Kusaka manipulating them, but they decide that their best bet is to aid both sides. So, and what they do is they try to neutralize the armies and prevent unnecessary deaths on the Battle of Guadalcanal, which is what the Attack on G Island title was referring to in the DVD titles, and they attempt to prevent death there, and it actually turns out that that's where Kusaka really screws him over, because he utilizes the Mirai to prevent the Americans from coming back, and then he's like, okay, Yamato, or whoever it is, I don't recall, but he's like, now it's time to go take that island and kill all those American troops, kind of thing. But one thing that I was, my preconceived notion was that there's no way they would make that big of a difference, because I know technology is super advanced with their modern battle cruiser, but the way I kind of looked at it is eventually they'd run out of missiles. And it wouldn't matter. They would just be overtaken by the American fleet. That's how I kind of looked at it. They're not going to have compatible missiles. Like the missiles of that time didn't have sonar or radar or whatever inside of it that allows them to change direction underwater and all that, the torpedoes and everything. So they can't just use old technology in their ship. It's going to be pretty much useless. They might as well just use those torpedoes in ships piloted in the ships of that time, whatever. But what is amazing about it is how wrong I was. Like, and they really make it clear that it's not about the weapons that they have or the maneuverability that they have. It's about the fear that they put in America's hearts. Like when I was telling you guys about that American submarine that tries to sink them, and they're like, they dodged our torpedo. And then after that, they shoot like 6 torpedoes. They literally use like basically all of their torpedoes on this one ship. And the Mirai fires up like those anti-torpedo rockets and stuff. I'm sorry, I don't have a grasp of what all these military things are called. But they shoot out these missiles and they take out all the torpedoes, and they eventually escape. And they actually launch a torpedo at the submarine. One of the guys on the Mirai, in the heat of the moment, just sends a missile at them, or a torpedo, and then they detonate it early so it doesn't end up causing any real damage to them. And for the Americans on that submarine, it's like, we never expected Japan to have this technology. Again, they've got the Japanese flag. They're members of the Japanese SDF. So from the American standpoint, it's like, they don't know where this has come from. They don't know that they're from the future. So when they look at it, it's like, oh my God, Japan has this sort of technology. They flicked us like a fly. They treated us like we were nothing, And the idea that from the American standpoint, what a morale crusher that could be. Just the idea that they don't know that what the situation is around us. They just know that this is not one of their ships. So they look at it as Japan could have an entire fleet of these ships. What is going on? We do not stand a chance fighting Japan. And the idea that they would actually surrender based solely on the Mirai existing in that time frame. And there's just the way that the story is told beautifully goes through all of these scenarios, and really, it's just it felt like my brain was being massaged while I was watching it. Just everything that they chose to show, they chose to do, felt very stimulating to my thought process of watching the show. And like I said, I had a specific sort of preconceived notion through what the DVDs were titled and stuff, where I was so intrigued, and that's just what happens when you're given puzzle pieces to a story, that when you're watching a show, like I mentioned in the Devadatsu review that you had to get kind of really lucky in order to not have the Terminator 2 plot twist ruined for you. And then I mentioned in Last Samurai that if you had even seen the theatrical trailer for Terminator 2, it gets ruined for you before you even have a chance to see the film. And how sometimes a movie or a series ruins things for you. Like a lot of times in a trailer, you'll be watching the movie and you're like, okay, I know I'm supposed to think that this character just died. But I don't, because I saw the trailer and I know that he's in at least 5 more scenes that haven't come up yet. So come on, let's just get on with this scene. I know you're trying to make me think he's about to die, but I know he's going to live, so just get on with it, whatever. And sometimes that can really break the flow of a movie. It's just a really interesting take on this concept, and I'll have to see the final countdown and see how the American movie from the 80s sort of stacks up against it. But I even though the final countdown probably has a more satisfying ending, because it probably actually does end, I don't think that it could possibly live up to the amazing experience I had watching Zipang. And like I said, this is 6 years went into looking for this and eventually getting it. I eventually got it on Amazon because I just got sick of looking for it, and I'm like, you know what? If I don't get it now, I'll never get it. So I just bought it. It ended up not being as expensive as I had remembered. Maybe the price had ended up going down, similar to what had happened with some other things. I don't know why, because so far as I know, this hasn't been re-released, and I guess that goes to say that you guys are probably going to have a really hard time getting it in that regard, because like literally from the moment I started looking for this show, I had never seen it anywhere for sale, anywhere in person, ever. I've never seen it on any shelf of any used DVD store, of any store at the time when it should have actually been for sale. I never saw it anywhere. I don't think I've ever seen it at Anime Expo. I don't think I've ever seen it anywhere in person. I had to buy it online. And I actually don't like buying things online, because part of the thrill of the chase of being a collector is finding things in person. That's what I really enjoy about collecting, and it also helps you curb your spending a little bit, and it also helps me to find shows that I would have not normally found, because in my pursuit of one show, I'll pick up another show just because I don't want to leave the store without getting anything, and it just sort of takes my collection in a lot of interesting directions. So, but in this case, I'm really happy that I actually broke down and bought it. Now, it's by Genion, like I said, so it's out of print, and you guys are going to have a hard time finding it. But you could still get it on Amazon, and you could get it for maybe like $150 or so. I'm not 100% sure on the price. I didn't really look it up. But basically, that's my review of Zipang, and I'm sorry that it's been very out of sync. Like I said, I've had a really terrible week. And I've got to go to the DMV coming up, and the first available appointment is like 2 weeks from now. I'm just at a loss for whatever happened to my wallet, and I just got to get things back in gear quickly so that this show can continue. Anyway, I hope you guys have enjoyed it. If you'd like to support me, you can subscribe, you can share this with your friends, you can leave me a like, you can comment, whatever. But let's go ahead and take Zipang and pop this sucker on the shelf. And if you guys want to check out last week's review of The Last Samurai, there's a link to it. I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy.